The housing situation in Los Angeles has become dire and is a direct contributor to the homelessness problem in Los Angeles. And it's largely centered around unintended consequences of policy initiatives and policy failures. The first thing that was unanticipated is the population surge. Overcrowding has increased and contributed to the housing demand. And of course, demand drives up uh, the available pricing on supply. And what we have witnessed, particularly within the last decade, but in recent years, pre COVID, is an increase as much as 20% in terms of um, unemployment contributing to homelessness and the demand on housing. People are literally falling out of their homes. We've particularly seen that after COVID, we expect a 20% increase in homelessness, largely due to the fact that the subsidies that are being received, the federal pandemic unemployment compensation, as well as compensations offered by the county and the city, are expected to run out, as well as some of the policy stays on evictions. So this is going to increase a significant number of homelessness, largely due to people not being able to afford the housing that they currently live in without income, having to replace their lost jobs. According to a study, a 2020 study by UCLA, you have, some 599,000 workers who have lost jobs and have no income during the pandemic. And that is going to certainly impact homelessness. We witnessed a 12% increase in homelessness from the year 2018 to 2019. And a lot of that was due, 53% of that was due to economic hardship. When we look at a recent study by the Economic Roundtable, reported that 600,000 residents currently pay about 90% of their income to rent, which is extremely out of proportion when you look at housing is supposed to take up 20 to 35% of your disposable income. And so that makes Los Angeles amongst the top cities in the nation that are considered unaffordable or too expensive to live. We already know that there will be waves of eviction that will be coming at the conclusion of COVID. And many of the renters will not have sufficient incomes to pay back rents, and landlords will not be able to continue to sustain tenants that are not paying rents. So we see this convergence of forces taking place, not just tenant landlord forces. We also see other forces, market forces, that are influencing how housing is priced in the city of Los Angeles, in the county of Los Angeles. You know, we know how many people are able to replace their homes or replace their housings is insufficient to the demand that is out there. We see the absence of rent caps have allowed 65% increase in rents over the past 10 years. And we also see that it is rents are far outpacing the rise of wage increases and income earnings. Okay. We, over the last decade, have built over 100,000 new units of housing. Okay. Over the last decade, yet 90% of the new housing is considered market rents and thus considered unaffordable to those who live in the city. Okay, we have competing interests, and those competing interests are developer interests versus resident interests. And the policy forces, particularly those who are seeking referendums to try to cap rents, have not been successful. Two statewide ballot initiatives have lost in the last 5 years. And we see the continuing of development market forces continue to build housing that residents and workers will not be able to afford. We see in those competing interests the policy forces having to choose between trying to satisfy the complaints of residents that housing has become unaffordable, yet developers, in order to attract developers to the region, they have to be able to build and price the units in a way that will allow them to sustain those units. Many feel that the developer forces have, in essence, overtaken the policy forces. When new developers come into the region and come into the city, they are attracted by the fact that they will be able to set market rents and be able to derive profits from market rents as opposed to below market rents. And so creating affordable housing has become a disincentive to developers without subsidies. Los Angeles witnessed the eradication of subsidized housing when the redevelopment agency went away. One of the solutions to being able to aggressively build housing is the tax credits that they would receive as a result from redevelopment subsidies. And that is a policy failure that was initiated by the state under Governor Brown, but certainly needs to be reconsidered post haste in order to arrest homelessness. And so when we talk about how do we address some of the policy failures and the absence of policy that seems to allow the market to go unrestricted in terms of pricing, we have to look at the need for the discussion around the convergence of these policy forces and these market forces. Development without affordable housing contributes to the lack of housing in Los Angeles. Unaffordable rents contribute to homelessness significantly because unaffordable housing, whether it's rental or whether it's home ownership, has become so unaffordable that people cannot relocate. We do see an exodus in the state in terms of people leaving the state, but they're not able to leave the state quick enough. And those who are disproportionately affected are those who are at the bottom of the wage earning scales, which tend to be African Americans and Latinos. The same people who were disproportionately and are being disproportionately affected in this COVID crisis. The demographic shifts, which many people want to talk about, and they talk about it in the context of gentrification, or they talk about it in the context of immigration. But the bottom line, it decreases market demand. And whereas it inflates market supply, again, resulting in unaffordable housing and tenant displacement. When people sell their houses or they sell their apartment units, the rents are reaggregated to market rates. And oftentimes, the change of ownership impacts those who are currently living in those units. And people see absorbent jumps in their rents, almost double, just so that the new owner can sustain the properties that they've recently purchased. So that's an unintended consequence also. There has been some policy initiatives to try to limit the amount of dollars and increases that new owners of properties can raise on existing tenants. That hasn't proved to be as successful as they thought it would be. Again, a convergence of policy forces versus market forces. Los Angeles reached a tipping point in terms of homelessness in 2012, meaning that if they didn't address homelessness by that time and be able to present viable solutions to homelessness, that they wouldn't be able to stop it. And in the last 10 years, we've seen that to be the case. While, there have been, over 100,000 new units of housing built in Los Angeles, we've seen homelessness still increase in excess of that by 12%. And so the policy response to the housing crisis has to be focused on building new housing that in effect allows affordable housing to take priority over market rent housing. And that is a complication that, again, causes the debate, the policy debate to stall. And the victims of that ends up being the folk waiting for the new housing or those who have been displaced in the homeless population who cannot find suitable housing. Temporary housing gets people off the street, but it doesn't give them permanent residence. And so we need to find more permanent housing solutions that allow people to move into affordable housing. The housing shortages have been exploited by the market forces. We have seen incentives in different parts of the city, whether it be downtown Los Angeles, whether it be Chinatown, whether it's Koreatown, whether it's the West Side, where the city has given incentives for development to build new housing, yet a relatively small portion of that housing is set aside for low to moderate income residents. And so while the housing stock is increasing, it's still unaffordable. And that's a resolution that the policymakers have to address. The policymakers are in a difficult position because while trying to attract housing, they find themselves oftentimes going against the interests of their constituent residents. And so that conversation oftentimes gets lost in the desire to address a quick fix to the housing problem. The other thing that we see is that we have a lot of NIMBYism going on in the city of Los Angeles, where you have single residence communities fighting multi-unit developers so that the density of their communities don't increase. There hasn't been sufficient conversation about the not in my backyard conversations because the concern of homeowners of there's multi-unit residents bring down the values of their homes, as well as, in their opinions, bring an undesired population to their communities. And when we are really talking about that conversation, we see a class divergence taking place, the have versus the have-nots, the home ownership class versus the rental class. And then, we oftentimes are forced to choose which segment of the population we're going to try to satisfy. And so, when we want to continue to have a conversation around housing, that conversation has to take place not in silos, but it has to take place as it relates to regional planning, uh, municipal planning. Um, we see the desire to bring commercial industry and jobs to communities, but also we see as a result the disproportionate increase in rents, the disproportionate increase in homeowner values that make purchasing homes just as unaffordable as renting homes. The conversation around solutions are rest in the ability of government to provide long-term subsidies for housing, as well as to providing living wage jobs. We oftentimes see those desirous of renting in Los Angeles or purchasing homes forced with the concern that their wages are not sufficient to cover home ownership. And home ownership is the most stabilizing force in our communities as it relates to housing and communities. Yet Los Angeles has become a renter city. And so how do we address the 800-pound gorilla in the room that unrestricted rents is a major factor that is contributing to the continuing growing homeless problem? We have to have a conversation about that, and it has to be a conversation that is rooted in doing what's in the best interest for the city as a whole, as opposed to what's in the best interest of individuals or in the best interest of silo communities. Across the board, cities are beginning to witness these huge increases in rents and these huge increases in property values that, again, wages have not kept up with the rise in rents and the rise in home ownership. And so hopefully policy studies now and in the future will take these unintended consequences as a lesson, that we can be incremental in our approaches. The defeat of rent control initiatives were often hinged upon part of the legislation not addressing homeowner concerns or property owner concerns, particularly as it relates to small property owners. However, to defeat these initiatives basically allows the status quo to remain in place. And local municipalities in the aggregate have not done a sufficient job in trying to address the status quo situations of unrestricted rents. A few municipalities have done so, particularly cities like Santa Monica, again, where you have a long established homeowner community that has put limits on development and have ensured that any new development include affordable rents. And so that's the conversation that we would hope begin to take place as we look at the state of Los Angeles, and particularly the state of Black Los Angeles. How do a community that is entrenched in poverty look at trying to address the homeless crisis? Housing is central to that discussion. Time does not afford us to wait for new bond measures and new propositions. There has to be public-private partnerships in which we bring in developers that are prepared to partner with the city to help resolve the crisis and set aside a significant portion of new development for affordable housing and affordable rents. The other factor that plays significant And Los Angeles' housing crisis, which is feeding the homeless problem, is the desire to um, bring about living wage jobs. Living wage jobs are essential to a city like Los Angeles, where the cost of living requires a job that exceeds $23 an hour. And we're still having debates around national minimum wage, whether it should be $10 an hour or $15 an hour, or whether it should be more. And that is not done without industry. We're beginning to see industry leave the state. We're beginning to see jobs go away, which again complicates both the housing crisis and the homeless crisis. And so Los Angeles has some work to do in terms of figuring out a delicate balance as to how its new housing stock will be able to fit into the wealth gap, and how it will be able to sustain when wages are below living wage in Los Angeles. We have to look at the intersection of these policy factors, both on the political side, the economic side, and the social side, and try to integrate a social responsibility to developing affordable housing that will not only prevent the increase in homelessness and the homeless population, but allow us to reduce the homeless population, whereby people can be able to expect that they would receive decent, affordable housing at a reasonable cost, and not have fear of destabilizing with dramatic turns in the economy.